Welcome, folks, to another edition of the Dr. Mark Foster Show. I realize that this program is following very closely the one before by about 5 minutes. Today, I plan to talk about the Apostle Paul and my own understandings of the Apostle Paul, and why I think that understanding and appreciating Paul are extremely important, not only for Christians, but for Baha'is as well. I think that without having an appropriate or a good understanding of the concept of Paul and what Paul did, it is very difficult to understand the message of Christ. Paul, in my view, was in effect the mirror of Christ. He was a minor prophet or a lesser prophet, I feel, who embodied the message of Christ, who reflected that message, and who presented it in a way that was appropriate to the various audiences that he addressed. First, let me read a quotation. This is from a letter written on behalf of the guardian of the Baha'i faith, Shoghi Effendi, to an individual Baha'i. It's dated March 13th, 1950. We cannot possibly add names of people we or anyone else think might be lesser prophets to those found in the Quran, the Bible, and our own scriptures, for only these can we consider authentic books. I will argue, I think, that, hopefully, that in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul is very clearly and very specifically referred to as a messenger of God. In my own case, it's very important, because for many years I regarded, and I'm ashamed to say it, the Apostle Paul as a usurper, as someone who had stolen the revelation of Christ from its legitimate foundations, from Peter, for instance, the rock, and who had, God forbid, distorted the message of Christ into something that was entirely unlike what Christ himself had revealed. Since changing my mind, or rather changing my heart on that issue, I have entered into a very close, cordial, loving, spiritual relationship with St. Paul. I frequently pray to him. I feel his presence close to me. When I close my eyes and think about him, I feel him around me. And I've apologized to him as best I can. Many times I've apologized to him. I've pleaded for his forgiveness. Now I treasure his soul very deeply, and in my meditations I sometimes feel very comforted by him. The problem, as I see it, has nothing to do with Paul. The problem has to do with the Church Fathers. Shoghi Effendi said that the Fathers of the Church developed a system of theology which could not be justified by the teachings of Christ. In effect, they created something entirely new. They distorted the gospel of Christ. Now, when they were looking for a systematic theologian to support their views, they turned to Paul. The problem is, as I see it, Paul was not a systematic theologian. He was a messenger of God, a minor prophet, a dependent manifestation of God. His purpose was, to my understanding, not to create a systematic theology. His purpose was to demonstrate the adaptability, the fluidity, the flexibility of the message of Christ. This is a quotation from the Apostle Paul. It's taken from the book of 1 Corinthians, chapter 9, verses 19 through 23, in the New Revised Standard Version. For though I am free with respect to all, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew, in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, so that I might win back the weak. I have become all things to all people, that I might by all means save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, so that I may share in its blessings. There, I think, is a very concise, very clear statement by the Apostle Paul of his prophetic mission as a messenger or manifestation of God, to demonstrate the adaptability and the flexibility of Christ's message. Sadly, Paul's teachings have been used in the exact opposite way. Rather than taking Paul and using his idea and saying, well, this shows that we need to look at the gospel of Christ and apply it differently under different circumstances, in different historical periods, perhaps, certainly in different parts of the world. People try to extract specific guidance that Paul gave to the Corinthians, the Ephesians, the Galatians, and unify them into a kind of theological system. That, I think, was the major mistake. Paul, however, was a relativist. He was a divine relativist. He was a pragmatist, or a practical man. And when one compares the letters or epistles that he wrote, for example, to the church at Corinth, which was apparently a rather immature church, with the more mature church at Ephesus, that becomes very clear. He gave different types of guidance to different congregations that were relevant to the needs of that congregation. And so, in effect, Paul became the living expression, the exemplar of Christ's love. Once, however, as I see it, Paul is misread as some kind of official church theologian. The obvious differences in his letters result in doctrinal confusion. And that is one reason, I think, why there are so many different denominations. Not the only reason, but one reason. Because you can very easily focus on one thing that Paul says in one of his letters and say, see, and then structure everything around that one statement, rather than taking Paul's letters and recognizing that he himself was being a relativist, applying Christ's gospel to specific congregations. Nevertheless, as long as the Roman Catholic Church and the various Orthodox churches, including the Oriental and Eastern Orthodox churches, maintains their positions of dominance, the issue of disagreement could be very skillfully resolved. Anybody who dissented from the official position of that church was simply branded a heretic. In many cases, heretics were executed. And so what we have seen today is really a multiplicity of Pauline-based theologies. Now, the reason why I think this is significant is because we know that there are lesser prophets in the Old Testament, but it's very rare that I've heard anyone speak of lesser prophets in the New Testament. Now, the word prophet, of course, is used in a very different sense in the New Testament than it's used in the Baha'i text. It's used more to refer to someone who is a seer, and so you have loads of people who are referred to as being prophets or prophetic seers. But Paul was not like that. Paul was not one of the original 12 apostles or messengers, and yet he called himself an apostle or a messenger. He recognized what his station was. According to Shoghi Effendi, the circumstances pardon me, the circumstances or conditions under which a messenger of God becomes awakened to his mission have often included some kind of visionary experience. So, the Bab viewed the martyred body of the Imam Hussein. Baha'u'llah had a visitation from the maiden. The Prophet Muhammad saw the angel Gabriel. This is how Shoghi Effendi explains it in one place. This is in God Passes By, page 93. The circumstances in which the vehicle of this newborn revelation, following with such swiftness that of the Bab, received the first intimations of his sublime mission, recall and indeed surpass in poignancy the soul-shaking experience of Moses when confronted by the burning bush in the wilderness of Sinai, of Zoroaster when awakened to his mission by a succession of 7 visions, of Jesus when coming out of the waters of the Jordan he saw the heavens opened and the Holy Ghost descend like a dove and light upon him, of Muhammad when in the cave of Hira, outside of the holy city of Mecca, the voice of Gabriel bade him, quote, "Cry in the name of thy Lord," end quote. And of the Bab when in a dream he approached the bleeding head of the Imam Hussein, and, quaffing the blood that dripped from his lacerated throat, awoke to find himself the chosen recipient of the outpouring grace of the Almighty. Once again in God Passes By, page 101, Shoghi Effendi wrote, "The Most Great Spirit, as designated by himself and symbolized in the Zoroastrian, the Mosaic, the Christian, and Mohammedan dispensations by the sacred fire, the burning bush, the dove, and the angel Gabriel respectively, descended upon and revealed itself, personified by a maiden, to the agonized soul of Baha'u'llah." Now, here is how the experience of the Apostle Paul is recorded in the book of Acts. Now remember, the Apostle Paul, when he was still known as Saul, was a persecutor of Christians. Before he experienced his spiritual awakening, he persecuted Christians. He certainly was no friend of Christ and the gospel of Christ. But then, all of a sudden, this is what apparently Paul experienced. It says, this is in Acts chapter 9, verses 3 through 6 in the New Revised Standard Version. He, Paul, approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. And falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, "Why are you persecuting me?" And he, Paul, said, "Who are you, Lord?" And he said, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." The sudden rush of revelation for many prophets can perhaps appear almost overwhelming. Some go on a retreat to process their experience. We don't know, of course, when in the course of his life a certain prophet becomes aware of his station. Before that redefining moment in time, many of them led ordinary, often unimpressive lives. Moses was a murderer. St. Paul had persecuted Christians. Then, in a moment, oh my God! And they referred to themselves by a name of God. Mirza Hossein Ali Nuri was Baha, glory, or Baha'u'llah, glory of God. Saul, which in Hebrew is ask or pray, became Paul, which is Latin for small or humble. Therefore, as I see it, as Peter is the stable rock of Jesus, as stated in Matthew 16:18, Paul might be Christ's pure and stainless mirror. Unfortunately, the great St. Paul's message has all but entirely been misinterpreted. Instead of appreciating the New Testament texts, the epistles, and context, using a patient and relativist reasoning, the Church Fathers misapplied Paul's letters to a body of very rigid creeds. However, Paul was not rigid. As the elegant divine messenger of relativism, I cherish Paul. Paul, to me, is the living heart of the gospel. It seems to me also that if, in retrospect, the teachings of Jesus had been read through the very clear lens of Paul's flexibility, much of the bloodshed, the accusations of heresy over so many centuries in the various Christian churches might have been avoided. This is Dr. Mark Foster. Until next time, have a good one.